Imagine living in a thriving, prosperous city where you have enjoyed the freedom to speak your mind, criticize your leaders, and elect your own representatives for decades. But now, a powerful government is taking it all away, piece by piece. What would you do? Would you stay silent to protect your safety and livelihood? Or would you risk it all to stand up for the liberties and rights that you hold dear? This is the story of one man who chose to take that stand, no matter the cost. A man whose fight for freedom of speech in Hong Kong has pitted him directly against Chinese President Xi Jinping and the full force of the Chinese Communist Party. Hong Kong may seem far away, but the battle being waged there is the front line in a global war of ideas. On one side is the notion that all men have inherent rights that no government can take away. On the other side is the CCP's belief that only a small group of elites know what's best for society and that individual liberties must be sacrificed for the greater good. Jimmy Lai was born in mainland China but fled to Hong Kong as a child to escape the poverty and authoritarianism of Mao Zedong's communist regime. In Hong Kong, he worked his way up from child laborer to successful businessman, eventually founding a clothing retailer named Giordano. But Lai had bigger dreams than selling t-shirts. Angered by the Tiananmen Square massacre, he founded Apple Daily in 1995, a pro-democracy newspaper that quickly became one of the most popular in Hong Kong. The paper was an unapologetic critic of both the Hong Kong government and the Chinese Communist Party, exposing corruption, defending human rights activists, and giving voice to Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. This made Jimmy Lai a major thorn in the side for Beijing, who has always seen Hong Kong's freedoms as a major threat to its rule. When the United Kingdom handed control of Hong Kong to China in 1997, it was with the promise that the city would keep its free press, free speech, capitalist system, and democratic government for 50 years under the one country, two systems framework. But in recent years, the CCP has nearly eradicated Hong Kong's autonomy. As the paper's popularity grew, so did the risk to Lai and his family. He received multiple death threats. In 2020, a pro-Beijing newspaper published personal details about his son to intimidate him into silence. And yet he persisted. In 2019, the Beijing-backed Hong Kong government introduced a bill that would have allowed extradition to mainland China of criminal suspects. On the mainland, the legal system is tightly controlled by the CCP, and prisoners are routinely tortured. The move sparked massive protests, with millions of Hong Kongers taking to the streets. Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily played a key role in the protests, extensively covering the demonstrations and providing an outlet for pro-democracy voices. Lai himself often joined the protesters on the front lines. Lai's involvement with the protests enraged Beijing. Chinese state media denounced him as a traitor, and CCP officials pressured companies to pull advertising from Apple Daily to drive the newspaper out of business. Ultimately, the extradition bill was withdrawn after months of huge protests. But that didn't stop the CCP from trying to crush dissent. In 2020, Beijing bypassed the Hong Kong legislature to enact the draconian national security law. The law criminalizes most forms of dissent and allows authorities to punish people for vaguely defined crimes like separatism and collusion with foreign forces. The law was clearly aimed at silencing Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement, and Jimmy Lai was one of its first targets. In August 2020, shortly after the law took effect, over 200 police officers raided the Apple Daily offices and arrested Lai along with several of his executives. Already convicted of unlawful assembly and fraud, Lai was eventually charged with colluding with foreign forces, for which he faces a possible life sentence if convicted. In June of 2021, hundreds of police again raided the newspaper's offices, arresting 5 executives under the national security law and seizing journalists' computers. Authorities froze the company's assets, making it impossible to pay staff and vendors. With no way to continue operating, Apple Daily was forced to print its final edition and shut down just days later. The raid sent shockwaves through the city as reporters worked through the night to put out one last defiant issue. Some broke down in tears as the final copy rolled off the presses. Apple Daily printed 1 million copies, far exceeding its usual print run, and yet demand outstripped supply as thousands lined up for a chance to secure a piece of history. The silence left behind by the paper's closure was deafening, a stark reminder of the voices lost and the dark future ahead. The forced closure of Apple Daily was part of a broader crackdown that has effectively dismantled the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Hundreds of activists, journalists, and former lawmakers have been arrested under the national security law. Many have fled to exile. And in 2021, Beijing passed another law allowing only patriots approved by the CCP to run for office in Hong Kong, making the legislature a rubber stamp. Hong Kong's then leader, Carrie Lam, said in defense of the crackdown,
or some of these human rights enjoyed by individuals under the international covenants are not absolute, as the covenant provisions specify. Where it is for the protection of national security, then sometimes some of these rights could be restrained in accordance with the law.
Her words echoed the CCP's authoritarian belief that individual liberties must be sacrificed for the greater good, as defined by the party. But Jimmy Lai fiercely disagreed. For him, as for us, freedom of speech, press, and assembly were non-negotiable human rights, the bedrock of a just and open society. In a 2019 interview, Lai delivered a message to Americans on the global war of ideas.
My simple message tonight is that bad behavior must be confronted, not appeased. And that you in the West need to have confidence in the superiority of your own system. China is never embarrassed to assert its own values, even though these values are rooted in perhaps the most horrible Western export mechanism. America needs to have the same confidence in its values and its own moral authority. If I could leave America with one thought, it will be this: do not underestimate your moral strength and promote your values instead of apologizing for them.
Jimmy Lai was willing to fight for those values, no matter the cost. His trial for sedition and collusion with foreign forces is ongoing.